I'm going to be doing today is I've got my Jeep Wrangler 2014 Sahara here, and the last time I worked on it and had to remove the intake to get down to the oil cooler slash oil temperature sensor, I actually accidentally over torqued. I mixed up my torque values because the lower intake has a higher torque value than the upper intake, and I mixed those up and over torqued the upper intake and broke the lower intake as a result. So I bought this upgraded aluminum unit from Amazon. There's pros and cons to the aluminum. Obviously, it's aluminum, it's going to be stronger. You don't have to worry about it getting brittle and breaking the way plastic does. However, my concern is that over time, this is going to hold more heat, and heat already being an issue under the hood and around the NOx sensors, oil temperature sensor, coolant sensor, and associated wiring underneath this intake, it might pose a problem for more heat in the long run. I'm not sure, but I'm going to go ahead and take a chance, install this. This was $100 on Amazon. I'll put the link in the description. It did come with all new gaskets. It came with this bolts that are gonna hold it down to the heads. So it also came with a few other different bolts. I'm not sure exactly what these are for, but when I get in there, I'll probably find out. I would imagine they hold the injectors and stuff like that. So we do have new gaskets as well. And I'm also gonna go ahead and do the driver's side valve cover gasket while I'm in here. I did the passenger side the other day because it was leaking quite a bit, dripping down and fouling out my O2 sensor over there. I had to change my O2 sensor like 3 or 4 times because it was leaking so much, but that was quite an extensive job. I had to remove the battery tray, the fuse box, the intake over there, and then all that piping was in the way as well for the heater core and everything else. So it was quite a pain in the butt. This side's gonna be a little easier, I think, but I am gonna go ahead and change this out while I'm in here, so it's still gonna be a few hour job. But let's go ahead and get this started. So I'm going to start the build here by removing the air intake duct from the throttle body. Next, I'm disconnecting the wiring harness that goes to the throttle body and getting that out of the way. Here I'm removing 2 of the bolts that hold the bracket that goes underneath the throttle body. You have to get this bracket out of the way in order to get the upper intake off. I've moved around to the side of the engine now, and I'm attempting to get to the bolts down along underneath the valve cover that hold this bracket on. There are 6 nuts that actually hold this on, and I've just removed the air intake so that I can reach my hand down there and actually get to the bolts. These are 2 of the upper bolts and 2 more bolts right under the air intake over here. Now this bracket is free and able to move out of the way. Next, I'm working on getting the bolts out of the air intake itself so that I can remove the upper intake. So there's actually another bracket over here on the driver's side. This also has 2 bolts on the top and 2 bolts on the bottom. The 2 bolts underneath are best accessed either underneath the Jeep or through the wheel well, which I'm showing you here. And there they are. I paused the video so you can see them a little bit better, but the black bracket comes down and is right there where the 2 nuts are. Now I'm removing some of the tubing that's going to the intake and everything, getting all that stuff out of the way. That way I can work on getting the rest of the intake bolts off, and I'm removing those right here. And now I'm pretty much ready to remove the intake and get that out of the way, the upper intake. All right, so if you looked at any of the reviews for this lower intake, what you would find is that people are saying the hardware is not sufficient. I did find that to be the case with mine. These screws, the ones that go along the side, the 4 were not long enough. The ones for the fuel rail were also not long enough. What I did, went to Ace Hardware and bought 8 of these, 4 to go there and 4 for the fuel rail. They're the same length. This is the bolt from the fuel rail. And then I also bought 11 washers, 3 nuts, and 8 of these bolts. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this, because for the longer bolt, for the 3 that go right in the middle on the intake, I could not find one of those. So I ended up using that threaded rod at first, and that was fine, but I wanted to go ahead and change it out for bolts later, so I got these on Amazon. I'll put the link in the description. And as far as cutting down the length, I cut them maybe 4 15/16 and or 125 millimeters long, whatever unit of measurement is your preference. They came 140 millimeters, so I had to cut them down just a little bit. So I'll put the link in the description to these, and then you just have to cut them down to length. I did taper the end a little bit to make it easier to start threading in as well. So getting back to work here, I did stuff some rags down in that lower intake so I don't drop any bolts down in there. And I've started removing all the bolts around the lower intake, disconnecting the fuel injector wires, and disconnecting the fuel rail, getting everything ready to go ahead and remove that lower intake. And I'm just using my drill here to go ahead and remove all of the lower intake bolts. Using this drill this way actually worked out pretty well. It's more quiet than using air tools. And if you pop a swivel on that thing, you can actually get back to the rear bolts pretty easily, making this job a whole lot faster and more simple. And there's that swivel socket I was talking about to get to that back bolt. So I've got that lower intake pretty much free. I just pulled out the fuel rail there. And I'm just making sure everything's loose. Actually, I think I'm removing the fuel injector harness right there. I've got that little pick, so I'm using that to pop up the little red tabs that are on the fuel injectors so I can get those all disconnected. One's fighting me over there. Using my little tool to remove the wiring harness so I can kind of fold that back, get that out of the way. And there we go. We're ready to get that lower intake out of there. And there it is, like removing a loose tooth. See you later, plastic intake. Giving everything a little quick wipe just to clean everything up. There was a bit of oil down there. I think my intake gaskets were leaking a bit, so I wanted to clean that up. And now I put the gaskets on the bottom of the new intake, put my bolts into position, and just give it a little bit of a wiggle to make sure everything seats well. Now I'm dropping in the bolts to get ready to bolt down that lower intake. Now I like to make sure that I get all the bolts started a few threads by hand first before torquing it down with any sort of wrench or anything else. But using my drill, this is just a regular Makita power drill, putting it on a setting where it doesn't make it too tight really helps to just drive those bolts in, because you would have to turn it like a zillion times using a wrench. And using this helps to get it spun in a little bit faster, and then I come back around with a torque wrench, make sure I'm torquing it to the proper torque values. That's what I'm doing here. And as you can see, even with the torque wrench, that little swivel on the end of the socket there is helping things move along a whole lot easier in the back of the engine. Alright, I've just about have everything torqued up here, so it's time to move on. I am doing the valve cover on this vehicle while I have everything taken off. I had already done the passenger side valve cover previously, so I was going to go ahead and do the driver's side since I had the intake off. And as you can see there, I did pop in those upper gaskets. I also put a few rags in those intake runners just to make sure I didn't drop anything down there while I'm removing the valve cover on the driver's side. So item number one on the valve cover here is this little cam sensor back here in the back of the engine. It's kind of a pain in the butt to get out, but there's only one Allen bolt holding it in, and then it just kind of pulls out. Next, I'm working on getting the coil packs pulled out, getting those things out of the way. And then I'm working on the cam sensors up in the front right here, using a Torx wrench to remove the 3 bolts holding those in and getting the wires out, getting those out of the way. So now, as you can see, I'm going around the valve cover, just pulling all the bolts. Nothing special there. That little swivel socket again is helping out immensely, and also the drill is making it a lot faster to work all these bolts and get all those removed. And of course, there's one more little bolt hiding in the back over here that's a little bit difficult to get to. I had to climb almost up into the engine bay to get to it, but I did get to it and was able to remove it and get my valve cover off. So here I'm gently using my interior pry tool to kind of wiggle underneath the valve cover there and get it started to remove. And you can see it's coming loose. Make sure you're not being too aggressive with this. It is a plastic valve cover and my Jeep had like 170,000 miles on it. That plastic will get brittle, so be careful when removing that. And we've got it pretty much free here. Get some of those harnesses out of the way and it's gonna pull right out. There we go. And it looks good under there. All of my camshafts look good. I didn't have any loose lifters or rockers or anything. 170,000 miles, I was happy with what I saw in there. Right now I'm just kind of going around the edge of the valve cover and giving everything a good wipe down, make sure I don't have any sand or debris or anything in the way. So when I install my new valve cover gasket, there's nothing in the way there. So there is a spot where you're supposed to put a little RTV. I just have a little flat razor where I was removing that RTV. And make sure you add RTV when you go to put your new valve cover on. That's what I'm doing right now, putting a little dab of RTV. I've already swapped my valve cover gasket on my valve cover and my cam sensor gaskets and the gaskets that go where the coil packs are. Everything's all been swapped on the bench and now I'm reinstalling it here. That's a pretty straightforward process. Just do keep in mind that the passenger side valve cover gasket and driver side valve cover gasket are actually a different shape. So make sure you don't get those two mixed up as you're installing them. My gaskets were actually very brittle and like they wouldn't bend at all. They just snapped when I tried to bend them. So this solved a lot of my oil leaks that I had dripping down the back of the bell housing. It looked like my oil cooler was leaking, but it was actually my valve cover gaskets. So be aware of that, guys. If you've got what looks like an oil cooler leak, check your valve covers because they could very well be leaking. This process here, I'm just, reinstalling everything. I'm getting my bolts around the edge of the valve cover, getting all those put back in place over here. Right now, I'm reinstalling my cam sensors and the little Torx screws that hold those in place. Again, make sure you're using your torque wrench. You don't want to over tighten any of this stuff. It is plastic. So be careful with that. See, I don't just tell you guys to use a torque wrench, I actually use one too. So for the initial tightening of the valve cover, I'm using my drill once again. I've got that set down to a low setting so that I'm not over tightening the bolts here. Getting that one back there in the back with that swivel attachment again. That thing was so handy working on this. So now I'm coming back and reinstalling my coil packs, putting my oil cap back on. Now I'm putting in the bolts for the coil packs, just snugging those up with the drill once again, and just tightening them by hand to make sure they're at the proper torque. Plugging the harness back in, reinstalling this cam sensor over here to the right. Once again, I do the initial tightening with my drill, and then I come back with just a regular wrench to snug it up. I did not use a torque wrench there. Next, I'm reinstalling my fuel rail. Now, I did make sure that I got new O-rings to go on the fuel injectors because I ended up messing up one of the O-rings while I was trying to reinstall it. Actually, I had my wife run out and buy some while I was working on it, but be aware that you may need new O-rings for your injectors if you damage them. Here I'm just putting the bolts back in that hold everything down for the fuel rail. and just making sure I get all the injectors in. And when you're putting those back in, do make sure that you're carefully kind of wiggling them back in. If you just shove it in, you're likely to end up ripping the O-ring on the side of the intake. Especially now that that intake is metal, the edges may be a little bit sharp. Now again, I'm coming back with my drill to just kind of tighten everything back up. And then I move on to my valve cover gasket with the torque wrench. I'll make sure I put all the torque values for everything down in the description, that way you guys have that. Now it's time to get those rags out of the intake runners. Put your little heat shield back in, reinstall your upper intake. And this is where I was using that threaded rod. It was kind of a pain in the butt, you know, putting that in by hand the way I did it. I don't think I would have been able to put them in first and then put the intake over it, but I was able to do it. Again, one of the things you could do is maybe take a dremel tool and cut a slot in the top of it. That way you can use a screwdriver to screw it in. Or down in the description, I've put a link to Amazon where you can purchase actually hex bolts that will go down in there that are the proper size. They were 140 millimeters long, the ones that I purchased. I think I had to cut them down to 120 or 125 millimeters for it to be the proper length. I do state that a little bit later on in the video, exactly what size they need to be. And as you can see, this is being kind of a pain in the butt, trying to screw those in with my fingers. Did take me a few minutes, but I did get them in. And then I come back with the nuts and put those on top. But right there, I'm installing So this is what everything looks like after I have it mounted. As you can see, I used that all thread. What I had to do was set the intake into place first, thread this in, and then put the nuts on top. I didn't torque it down to the factory torque specifications because that felt really tight when I was putting it on. I don't know if I had my torque wrench set not appropriately or what, but it seemed really tight, so I didn't go with that. I threaded these in by hand, and that was a little bit difficult and time consuming, but what you could do is take a little Dremel tool and cut a slot in there, and then you could use a flat bladed screwdriver to install these. But that aluminum lower intake is in, it looks pretty good. How that's gonna work over time with the extra heat and everything, I'm not sure, but I'll keep you guys updated on that. Thank you very much for watching YouTube. All right, so believe it or not, I'm just now getting around to editing this video. It's been about 6 months and I've had this intake on the Jeep. Just wanted to give you a quick update and let you know that I've not really experienced any issues at all coming from the intake. I was a little bit concerned when I installed it. Others have expressed that they were concerned about the heat soak that might happen. I live here in Central Florida where it's like 90+ degrees all year long, basically. And after 6 months of driving around with this, I installed it in November. It's now April. I have literally experienced 0 issues with it at all. I did make sure that the last time I worked on my oil pressure sensor and coolant temperature sensor harness in there, I did put some heat shielding tape around that harness because I had issues with that before. I don't know if something chewed it or if those wires melted, so I wanted to make sure that was wrapped well with some thermal tape. So I did do that. That would be the thing that I'd be most concerned about, would be heat staying trapped underneath there with all that, the knock sensor wiring harness and everything else. But 6 months later, no issues so far. I'll keep you updated if I do run into any issues with thermal temperatures getting too high underneath that intake. Everyone, if you enjoyed today's video, I would invite you to go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below right there on the right-hand corner. And if you felt that the products in today's video is something you might like to own yourself, there's a product link right up there to the right, upper right-hand corner, or down in the description will be a product link for you to purchase the product as well. Thank you very much for watching YouTube.